Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. But you know, Alibis, it's 12:38 in the morning on Sunday, and I'll tell you why it's 12:38. I just did this once, only to find that my little overlay here that I've been working on was still set on Sins of Our Mother. So I felt like I had to redo it because it's not Sins of Our Mother. This is George Wagner trial. So I wanted to do this tonight and get it over with because tomorrow I'm taking a chill day with my daughter, my oldest. We're going to go see what we can get into. First, thank you to Maria and somebody who knows who exactly they are for your donations. I really appreciate it because that's going in my Boise travel fund. It looks like I'm going to be going to Boise more than once or twice like I had originally planned. So I asked my kids, do you like the cold? You want to go to stay in the cold for 10 weeks? And they were like, nope. So anyways, also big thank you to everybody. I'm blown away how many people have bought t-shirts and hoodies and all kinds of stuff from the newly redecorated merchandise. I've had a lot of fun doing it. Still have a lot of ideas, so keep your eye out. Music fact of the day before we get started. Jewel was homeless and living in her car when she was discovered by a record label. A year later, she released her first album, Pieces of You, which included the hits Who Will Save Your Soul, You Were Meant for Me, and my favorite, Foolish Games. All right, so let's get started in this. Day 10. If you remember, that was a really short day because a juror got sick. So they ended around 2:30, came back the next day, which was, I was going to say yesterday. It was Friday. And it wasn't really long days. So hopefully we can get through this super, super quick and get you caught up for Monday. So day 10 started out with the defense arguing about the gruesome photos. And the judge just doesn't understand what you're saying is gruesome. He says that he's watched the jury. Nobody seems to be repulsed by it. Too bad. The defense mentions a family member had to go out. And so the prosecution says, look, we're not trying to overexpose the jurors. We're not using all the photos we could, only what we need to prove the case. Jake says George accompanied them and went into some of these residences, so it's relevant. The judge overruled it, and we get started. So BCI agent Bryan White was on the stand. So he went to the home where Dana, Hanna May, and little Chris were murdered. They considered that scene 3 of the 4 crime scenes. And Special Agent Perry, I think it's Roser, was with him. So they arrived with a search warrant and walked around the property taking photos. And then eventually they move outside. This is an outside picture of Dana's residence right there. A nice little place. It was being redone. Some additions being put onto that. And so when they arrive back inside the house, there we go. See, I'm having problems. I should probably wait till tomorrow to do this, but nope, I'm not. So they move inside. Outside, there wasn't really anything of value that they saw. They found a couple of cigarette butts. One of those had Hanna May's DNA on it. They found a $5 bill just laying randomly in the yard, but the DNA on that was insufficient. So nothing outside they found. And they started actually processing the scene about 2:30 in the afternoon. So remember, these guys were killed overnight. It's been a while. We know that Dana was still awake at 3 or 3:30 based on social media posts, as well as some texts or calls to Chris kind of late. So they had been dead quite a while before they even started processing. So the house had an addition on it with an extra bedroom and a bathroom added. And I just love how Chris Sr. took care of her even after they were divorced because they have kids together and grandkids. And he really, it seems like he really took care of her. And that was really, really sweet. So bedroom number 1 is where they started taking the photos. This is just the outside on the left. This is how it looked. Of course, they're not showing anything graphic. This picture on the right was the first day. Actually, Dana is still under those covers, but there's nothing graphic. But they started in little Chris's room taking photographs. And the gosh, this thing's going haywire, y'all. The closet door was open and little Chris was found laying in bed on his stomach, and he was covered by a red comforter, and he was shot multiple times in the head. So they showed the jury a photo of him laying in the bed, and Big E was in there for that, and he said that it was very, very gruesome. Because little Chris was shot in the back of the head, he said it almost looked like his face was kind of separated and his glasses were kind of crooked on his nose. So he must have fallen asleep with his glasses on. The gunshots were mainly to the back of the head, and they took a close up photo of at least one gunshot wound they could see at that time. And so part of his back was exposed. The cover was not all the way up, and so they could see blood on his shoulder area. They showed a photo of a backpack and a pair of boots that were in his room, and then a close-up of a blood stain that was on the carpet right by the bed. So they move out of little Chris's room and go in the kitchen, and they take some pictures of some baby bottles that were in the sink and appeared to have recently been washed, as well as some dishes. There were no signs of forced entry in the front door, storm door, door chain, or door jamb. So bedroom number 2 is going to be Dana's room. That's on the right there. Just wanted to show you that real quick again. And they could see blood on the bed sheet, and she was under that comforter. There was a piece of paper on Dana's bedside table that had a work schedule. We know she worked a double that night, which I think kind of threw the timing of the murderer's plans off a bit. And so they had to wait a little bit. They recovered the comforter off of Dana, and they saw her lying on her back with a pillow covering her face. When they removed that, they saw she had been bleeding from her head area. At first, they saw at least one gunshot wound right away. There was brain matter that had been lost that was on the bed close to the other pillow that was beside her. She had a gunshot wound to the forehead. On the right side, they found another gunshot wound, and they saw 3 between the head and the face area. So picture number 3, or bedroom number 3 rather, was Hanna May, and they showed the jury a photo of Hanna May in bed deceased, and there's a baby crib right beside the bed. As you know, she had a 5-day-old Riley she had just given birth to. On the floor, there's a pillow on one side of the bed with a blood stain, and then 2 pillows on the other side of the bed. There was a photo shown that was documenting her position and state of clothing, which had her right breast exposed. We know both her and Hannah Gilley were nursing, and it's kind of thought that maybe they were nursing at the times they were murdered. So in processing the scene, they look for any kind of evidence and shoe impressions. That's going to come in later in a big way because we know Angela bought those shoes at Walmart, made the excuse they were grandpa's shoes. She threw them out, but the lab tech went on a scavenger hunt and eventually found these shoes at Walmart. So what the BCI agent was explaining, the entryway into the door, it had like a plastic or vinyl tile entryway and then tile floor in the kitchen, but some carpet separated that. He said entryway is the best place to find shoe impressions because walking on carpet removes a lot of what's on your foot, and then you lose evidence. If the impression were left in blood, you can enhance it with chemicals, one of those being, I think he said, leucocrystal violet. Or what they'll do is they'll just go ahead and cut that floor out and take it. They didn't find anything of value in the kitchen. So back to the shoe prints, they did see some boots that appeared to be first responder boots, but they did isolate a print that stood out to them. And they used fingerprint powder to expose the pattern of that shoe. They did a lift of that footwear impression. And you can see on the bottom right, he's holding that up. I'll put a link in the description for this. And so they lift it. They have kind of this sticky foam on a long rectangular thing thing that they gather it with. And to lift it, they take off the protective layer and put the sticky part on the impression. And then that gunpowder, or not gunpowder, but the fingerprint powder, it grabs that impression and puts it on there. That's going to come in big later, I think. The shoe impression is in the openings. There was a point where the prosecutor said that where Jake said that George was standing, I believe in this house, maybe is right where they found a shoe impression. So bedroom number 1 is little Chris, and they show a red bed comforter that was taken for evidence. When they removed the comforter, little Chris had no clothing on, and between the bed and the closet was a blood stain. So the agent took a sample of that. Eventually, it came back positive for little Chris's DNA. They also found a phone cord in his room. It was plugged in the wall, but there was no phone attached. So they wanted to try to test that for some trace DNA, but only little Chris's DNA was found on that cord. They checked the whole house for his phone and never found it. They show the jury a picture of the blood stain of the sheet and mattress he was laying on. They did not send that to the lab for DNA. And they did a blind swab from little Chris's interior door handle. There was insufficient DNA on that. So back to Dana's room. She had a flower print comforter collected from her room, and both parties stipulate the comforter was sent for DNA testing, and there was insufficient DNA for comparison. They took the pillows in the room, the one from her face and beside her. There were no bullet holes in those. So the pillow was placed on her face after, which a lot of these people, like her and Chris and Gary, were covered up. I don't think Kenneth was. Little Chris was on his belly. Hanna, I don't think was covered, but you wonder, she's kind of a mother figure. And I've always heard that they cover people's faces kind of just out of shame for like a second. These people had no shame, but it's curious why they did cover some and not others. So there's blood and brain tissue on the pillow on the side that was actually touching her face. And the stipulation was the pillow covering Dana's head was a complex mixture of DNA, not suitable for comparison. So I was curious what makes up a complex mixture. And so I went to Google. And the 3 main factors determine the complexity of a mixture. Number 1, how many people contributed DNA to the mixture? More contributors makes the mixture more complex and therefore a lot more difficult to interpret. Also, how much DNA did each person contribute? Even if a mixture contains plenty of DNA overall, one or several people might have contributed only a small amount. And the lower those amounts, the harder it is to try to separate a profile. Also, how degraded is the DNA? It degrades over time and with exposure to the elements. This can also increase the complexity of analyzing that DNA. So both sides stipulate the pillow beside Dana, that item was not submitted for DNA testing. And then he explained the decision of whether or not to test is made kind of at a meeting of the minds between the BCI agents and the lab. And so they determine the most important items first. And if the same kind of meeting happens if more items are found to need to be tested, but all evidence is important. But he said what sets them on the right path early on, that's what's going to get tested first. There was a phone cord taken from Dana's room. There was no sufficient DNA on that. And there was one lead fragment found on Dana's bed. A photo of the blood stain on her sheet that was on her bed was taken, and they did not send that to the lab, mainly because with so much blood, they knew that the DNA was going to come back to the victims in each respective room, essentially. They took a blind swab from Dana's interior door handle. The mixture of DNA was insufficient for testing. So bedroom number 3 was Hanna May, and she was found laying on her right side away from the entrance to the room. There was a pillow on her bed. It was not submitted for DNA testing. There was no phone or cord in her room. They did take the bed sheet, but did not send it to the lab. Now, they did talk about a door. One door did have defects. It was unknown when they occurred. There was also a defect in the latching mechanism that didn't come back in that I know of, so they kind of just left that there. So the coroner came on the scene to examine the bodies between 8:20 and 8:30 p.m. on the 22nd. Now remember, we think these murders happened like 3 o'clock in the morning, maybe a little later. So little Chris, they start with him and they start taking photos as they go in the room with the coroner. They have him rolled over. He was in rigor mortis. His muscles were stiffening, which starts about 8 to 12 hours after death, up to 24, and then it releases and is movable again at some point. So they show a photo of little Chris's body placed in the body bag with his name and his date of birth, which was November 4th, 99. And the BCI agent helped put little Chris in the body bag. So they move on to Dana's room, and they roll her over to expose her back for exam. She was in rigor mortis, and she was placed in a body bag with a date of birth of August 29th, 1978. Before she was removed, they marked an area for blood collection, and it was in the left thigh area. And there was a circular blood stain that they took, and it was positive for her DNA. At first, they thought it was a little bit of an odd place for there to be blood because she was shot in the head and was covered. There was a large amount of blood in the bed and on her body. She had no defense marks on her either. So they move to Hanna May's room, and they show a photo of the backside of Hanna May after she's been rolled over. Also, she was in rigor mortis. She had pooling of the blood on her back because clearly after she was murdered, she didn't move. She had an additional injury they saw after they moved her, and it was a gunshot wound on the left side of her head. They rolled her onto her right side to check for any other evidence and her body bag. She was placed in there with a date of birth of April 7th, 1997. Other than in the bedrooms, there was no blood or DNA in the house at all. They also did a forensic vacuum, and I put a picture of this on here because it's pretty cool. So this is not like your, shark vacuum, but it actually, they can use this on the bodies and also on carpet materials or anything for any kind of trace evidence. And clearly, I don't think that they found anything because it really, you think about the Wagners, they never found any DNA or fingerprints here at this house. I think this is where they found the shoe print. But I mean, you don't want to say it was almost the perfect murder because they got caught, but it was 2 years before they were arrested. So I'm really curious for the next phase of this trial, which is going to be how they did it. And Jake has sung like a canary. I really, really hope that he agrees to testify and be taped. So the filter, also they changed the filter for each victim. They filtered all 3 rooms. So projectiles, Dana, they found a fragment just in the bed. Shell and cartridge casings, Hanna May, there was one under the crib beside the bed in her room. That was the only casing found in the residence, and there was insufficient DNA on that casing. Remember, they had the brass catchers. So most of the casings were caught in that. And one thing this also stood out to me about the even with 3 victims, the testimony that took the longest was Chris Sr. and Gary, because they were awake when this happened. And so there was a little bit more chaos, a lot more evidence sort of around the house. You had the drag marks, you had all kinds of stuff. You had the grow operations. I was surprised really at how quickly Frankie and Hanna Gillies went, and then how quickly this one went as far as testimony goes. He was asked about nobody really obviously hearing anything going on because there's some distance. Little Chris's room apparently is at the opposite end of the residence than Dana and Hanna May. And he also said that suppressors could be used, which would, not make it loud. So as we know, no DNA fingerprint evidence of the Wagners found in the house. They look inside these cars that are parked outside, and they don't really take anything from there. Dana's wallet was open, her driver's license was inside, and there was money inside. At the scene, the agent was brought the diaper from the 5-day-old baby, who was taken to the hospital. It was brought back to him and put into evidence. So the crime scenes for weeks were secured by uniformed law enforcement officers because, there's a chance they may have needed to return to those crime scenes to do additional investigations. So we know they decided to secure those trailers in storage for safekeeping and also if they needed to return to the scene. I remember there being some controversy about that because they were sent to an impound lot where they were exposed. And I think for some time they weren't guarded and the gate was open. So that can totally compromise a crime scene. And I'm very curious to see if that is brought up in the defense's case. So if they wanted to re-enter these residences, they would have needed additional search warrants. So at some point, this agent was asked to go back to Frankie and Hannah Hazel's residence to document the position of the bolt lock on the back door. This was after the residences were moved, and it was in the unlocked position. I'm pretty sure in the openings that the prosecutor said, I think Jake came in through that window and then opened the door for George and Billy so they could keep a lookout. There were 3 there, and little Chris, his room was at the other end. So I guess maybe they were a little worried. If he heard something, he might've come out. He was asked at a later date to swab one of the windows of Frankie's residences as well. At a later time, they went and removed 4 to 5 older cell phones that were broken. The screens were all cracked, and they were never examined because they didn't feel like there was, any evidence that would have been found on those. It was clear they were older phones. So back to Hannah and Dana and little Chris's, there was no evidence of any marijuana grow or evidence of any drugs at the house. At some point, this agent went into each of the crime scenes, so he's very familiar with all of them. The prosecutor asked about the cleanliness and the clutter compared to Dana's house in the others, and the defense objected, saying it doesn't matter. And he said it was orderly and tidy, no clutter. Everything had a place and it was relatively clean. We know at Frankie's house, the clutter did kind of make things a little more difficult to get the scans of the interior and also to move around. He did a blind swab on the window frame where the window would have come into the frame, if that makes sense. The chain and the door handle at Frankie's. This took place on December 15th, 2016. So remember, 21st, 22nd of April is when these murders happened. In December of 2016, they're still gathering evidence. The DNA was insufficient, and the samples were consumed during analysis, which means there was nothing left. And you have to wonder, because at this point, there was a lot of speculation and rumor about drug cartels. And I don't know at this point if I'm sure they had the Wagners on the radar somewhat, but yeah. So, okay, now we're up to the forensic pathologist, Dr. Lohmann. I love her. She's great. Dana was the 3rd autopsy of the day. Remember, they did the women first. And she was placed in their cooler there at 6:23 a.m. and removed shortly after when the first autopsy was started. And she explained that as they're doing one, they're doing other things on the other bodies. So the techs in there can take the blood, take the fluid from the eyes while she's doing the x-rays or whatever. So Dana was not in that cooler very long. This was around 7 or 8 a.m. when the first autopsy was started, who was Hanna May. And they show photos of her unzipped in the body bag, and she was not clean yet. They clean them up. So x-rays, they did a side x-ray. You can see she had, I'm sorry, this is Dana, my bad. Side x-ray, you can see she had fillings in her teeth and about 6 large pieces of bullet and bullet fragments in her head. She had a total of 5 gunshot wounds. So this is Dana's diagram. What I've done is try to point out where the gunshot wounds are because it can get a little confusing looking at this. Number 5 was in the chin, And I did not see a picture of that. I might have missed it. But so gunshot wound number 1 was on the right side of the forehead. So you're looking at it and you're saying that's left. But if you're looking down at her, that would be her right side, if that makes sense. Because I had some people say, no, you're saying left, it's right. But you're looking at this in an opposite way, as if you're looking down at somebody who's asleep, that's going to be her right side of the face. So the gunshot wound 1, right side of the forehead, the distance was intermediate, which is 3 inches to 3 feet. She had some red stippling from gunshot powder touching the skin. The path of that bullet traveled straight across and struck the left side of her head. It broke the bone, and she points to the temple area in her head, and it did not exit. It actually fell inside her skull to underneath her brain. That's insane. Gunshot wound number 2, you can see that it's just right beside that one. It's close to the center of the forehead and it made a round hole. The distance was more than 3 feet from when the shot took place. And the path of the gunshot wound was similar to number 1. It crossed right to left, struck the bone on the left side, fell underneath the brain. And it was a front to back shot that had a downward angle. Gunshot wound number 3 was the center of the forehead, and that is a keyhole wound. And I actually pulled up a picture of a keyhole wound to show this is not real. This is a mock-up. So if you're squeamish, you don't have to worry. But so she was shot at such a sharp angle that it tore the skin and it just grazed the skull. It did break a hole in the skull and the bullet broke apart. A small piece entered her brain, but most of it continued in an upward direction. And above the keyhole injury on Dana is an abrasion. And she said it was very superficial and could be from the bullet scratching the skin as it continued upward. I kind of wonder if he wasn't at the foot of the bed when he shot her. That's kind of how it makes sense. But you see that keyhole pattern there. I'll put all these photos in a link in the description. So you do see that keyhole pattern. All right, so we're going to go back to her diagram. This would not have been instantly lethal, but it would have knocked her out. Gunshot wound number 4 is just above her right ear along the hairline. They show a photo with the hair shaved, and the distance of that shot was more than 3 feet. And there's bruising from where blood is pooling on her cheek, which is probably, how she was tilted. It was more than 3 feet, that shot as well. There's bruising. I'm sorry. The path went across to the other side. It was found on the left side, lodged in her brain. Gunshot wound number 5, it was along her right chin, and it was close. It was 3 inches to 3 feet. You can see gunpowder burns on her face. The bullet struck and broke her jaw, and they collected 2 pieces of lead under her skin. Here's the thing. This gunshot wound would not have been fatal. If you remember in openings, according to the prosecutor, Jake said he heard Dana moaning and went back in and shot her more. So I kind of have the theory maybe this gunshot was first and then it didn't kill her. So he had to go back in there. And how terrible, because you don't know what she's hearing if she's laying there moaning and somewhat conscious. Is she hearing her children get murdered? It's just horrifying. Her right eye, her upper and lower eyelid had a bruise from the orbital bones being broken, and it seeped into the white of her eye. So she had that really red. You may have seen it if somebody gets really hit hard in the eye and the white is blood red. That was from the trauma that happened inside her head. The left eye had the bruising as well from the other gunshot wound. So they go through the evidence that was taken from her, which was the typical stuff. She had on a nightgown and panties, the DNA card, fingernail clippings, the clipper used to take the fingernail clippings, sample of her hair. So the bullets that were recovered from Dana were consistent with the ones they removed from Frankie and Hannah Hazel. They were inconsistent with the ones found in Chris Sr. and Gary's. We know Billy, we think Billy shot Chris Sr. and Gary and used the Glock. So I believe these 3 Jake did. The injuries were consistent with the smaller caliber bullet. She had no defensive wounds on her arms or her hands. She was not in rigor mortis, but at the morgue, but she was at the scene of the murder. Toxicology, just caffeine. Remember, she had worked a double that night. She didn't get home till very late. Cause of death, obviously, multiple gunshot wounds to the head. So we're going to jump over to Hanna May's diagram. She had the second least number of shots. Kenneth had 1 to the eye. Hanna May had 2. She was checked into the medical examiner's office at 6:29 a.m. on the 23rd of April. She was the second autopsy. And this next part really, really bothers me. She had a tattoo at the bikini line with the initials EJW. Well, what's Jake's full name? Edward Jake Wagner. I find that gross. I mean, if it's her decision, that's her decision, but I can totally see how controlling he was. Maybe it's like, you're going to get my initials tattooed right there. She had earrings on that were seen in the x-rays. So we go to the x-rays. There is a side view of her head. Small white pieces of bullet in her head. She had the 2 gunshot wounds. So gunshot wound number 1, left side of the back head. It was kind of upper. You can see it in that left picture. And the distance was more than 3 feet. The path it took was across her head, left to the right side, and it was back to front. So the bullet was found in the side of her head, lodged inside her brain. She pointed above the ear near like the top of her head where it was found. And so gunshot wound number 2 was behind her left ear. It was left to right. The bullet split in 2, and she couldn't determine if it was back to front or front to back. The distance was also greater than 3 feet with that one. There's indentation, which changes colors to yellow and brown after death. She was laying on something hard, apparently on her left side at the time of her death, and it made a mark on her skin. Her brain had bruising on the underside due to the bullet going through. It actually rattles the brain and shakes it really hard. And she had lacerations in the brain. So on the internal examination, it was found that she was obviously lactating. And the other thing, her uterus was enlarged because she had just given birth. It takes weeks and weeks for the uterus to go back to a normal size. And here's something she's never seen before. Hanna May had a blood clot in the vessel between the uterus and that goes to the left kidney. It isn't lethal. It's not related to the crimes or any of the gunshot wounds, but she had never seen it before, so she documented that. The clothing they collected from Hanna May was a gray t-shirt, black shorts, black underwear. They did all the typical hair clippings, fingernail clippings. Toxicology, positive for caffeine. That was it. Cause of death, multiple gunshot wounds to the head. So now we get to Lil Chris. Poor dude. Poor little dude. His autopsy was Sunday, April 24th. He was the first one that day. Remember, they did the girls, then the men, and then they did Chris Sr. by himself on that Monday because he was the worst injured. He was placed in the cooler at 6:17 a.m. on April 23rd. They show a photo to the jury of him in the body bag as he was put in. He was not wearing clothes, and he had 4 gunshot wounds. She noticed all 4 were in his head. So they go to the x-ray, front to back x-ray of his head. You see bullets in his head on the film. Multiple bullets on the left side, 1 on the right side. The left x-ray shows the location of bullets, 2 of which were overlapping a bit. And gunshots 1, 2, and 4 were towards the back of the head. And then gunshot 1 was at the right side at the top of his head. Gunshot number 2, right side above the ear. 1 and 2 are from far away, and both 1 and 2 bullets went right to left and ended up lodged in his brain. Kind of took the same path. Gunshot wound number 3, right side a little higher than his temple. Right to left direction, they could not determine the distance at which he was shot at. Gunshot wound number 4, behind the right ear. It's really more towards the back of his head. The pathway was right to left, and they could not determine the distance, which means it was greater than 3 feet. The skull was fractured all the way across the skull. The base of the skull was also fractured. The orbital plates were broken. That's right behind your eyes. The inner bone of the ear was broken, and he was bleeding out of his left ear. There were no exit wounds found, and they did recover those projectiles from his head. His hand actually was pruned during the autopsy due to the fact that his hands were resting in a pool of blood in that body bag. Excuse me. Toxicology, he was positive for caffeine. And the forensic pathologist says if a silencer was used, it could alter the estimates of the distances that she is giving right now. So cause of death, obviously, multiple gunshot wounds to the head. So cross-examination, how would a silencer determine distance? And she said it fits in the area of the muzzle, and it can grab the suit or the stippling that would land on the body. And so the defense asked the distance could be closer than what you've observed, and she says yes. So he says, you don't know the order of shots or time between the victims, and she says no. So he has a question about Chris Jr. Any of those 4 shots would have been fatal, and she said yes. And then he says Hanna May had 2 shots to the back of her head, and she said the back half of her head. And so the defense asked, where's gunshot wound 1? On the back of her head? And she says yes. And then I know where he's going with this. He said, where would the gunman be? And she said he could be near her, next to her, or behind her. And the defense says, is that consistent or inconsistent for her to be looking at the person that shot her? And the forensic examiner says with the bullet traveling back to front, that would be inconsistent. Now, here's the thing. In the openings, according to Jake's confession, Hanna May saw him, but he didn't think she recognized him. So I think that's where that may come in. So we know Hanna May, he says, had 2 gunshot wounds. 1 and 2 were both, we couldn't determine the distance, and she said 3 feet or more. So he asks, where was gunshot wound number 2? He asked, where was gunshot wound number 2? And she said behind her ear. The defense says, so the same area but lower, and she says yes. And he asked, would a silencer affect your opinion of the distance? And she says yes. Then he goes to Dana. She had 5 gunshot wounds. 1 and 5 are 3 inches to 3 feet. A silencer could make it closer. She says yes. 2, 3, and 4 further away. She says yes. So little Chris, all 4, he asks, you could not determine the distance. And she said that's correct. So on redirect, the prosecutor said, you were asked for little Chris if any of the 4 could be fatal, and you said yes. Regarding Dana, number 5 in the jawline would not have been fatal. And she said no. Prosecutor said, if the jawline was first, would she be able to make noises? And she says yes. Then the prosecutor says, number 3, the keyhole wound, would that render her unconscious? And she said yes. Then she said, with Hanna May, you were asked about certain positions. If she's facing away from the door where someone enters into and is turned to that side, when you received Hanna May at your facility, was the shirt in any position? And she said, yes, pulled up over the right breast, laying on her right. This prosecutor knocked it out of the park and totally shut this down with him saying, because Jake's testimony or his confession is she saw him. So here's what the prosecutor does. So if someone comes in and sees him and turns away instinctively to protect her newborn, are the injuries and pathways consistent with that? She says, yes. Good job by that prosecutor. Smart move. On a recross, the only thing he says, you're not aware of the lighting condition at the time of the murders. She says no. So there you go, guys. We are all caught up. I'll be back on Monday. We'll break it down, the best parts of the testimony. The last crime scene that needs to be covered is Kenneth's. I think that will be pretty quick. He had the one gunshot wound to his eye. Very small crime scene. Chris Sr.'s took the longest because there was so much chaos in that house. So I think maybe now we're going to start getting into the part where we learn how they did it. And that's what I'm interested in as well. Anyways, I will see you guys on Monday. I hope you have an amazing Sunday and take care, and we'll see you soon.